All right, well, aloha and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We also have a bunch of folks on Zoom too, so we have great attendance. Thanks for coming out um, for A Constitution in the Making, Power, Reform, and the Road to 1978. I'm Colin Moore, a faculty member at UHU Hero and the director of the Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution. This event is part of a larger public humanities initiative called the Past's Plan for Hawaii's Future, which is a collaborative effort to reflect on the origins and legacy of the 1978 Constitutional Convention. Our project includes public events like this one, classroom resources, and a digital archive. You can look at our website, which is highplan78.com. We'll send out a link to everyone who registered. So this evening's panel is going to examine the broader political and legal forces that gave rise to the 1978 Constitutional Convention, including pivotal initiatives like the Commission on the Year 2000. While the convention itself is one focus, our goal is also to situate it within the larger political and intellectual currents of the 1970s. What ideas were circulating, what reforms were being demanded, and how those debates shape the place we live in today. So first, let me do some acknowledgements. This project is made possible through the generous support of the Hawaii Council for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I'd like to acknowledge Stacy Hoshino from the Council, who is here with us tonight. Thank you, Stacy. I also want to thank the Judiciary and Chief Justice Mark Rechtenwald for their support of the Judiciary History Center, which has played such a vital role in preserving and interpreting Hawaii's legal history. I also want to thank Matt Matisse and Rana Govea over there from the Center for their partnership in organizing this evening's programs. And finally, to acknowledge the Friends of the Judiciary History Center and the Matsunaga Institute for the costs of the refreshments tonight. So we're going to talk from until about 6:30 or so. We'll begin with some opening remarks from all of our distinguished panelists who I'll introduce to you in a moment. Then from about 6:30 to 7 or so, we'll take your questions here and online. And then until 7:30, you are welcome to enjoy some snacks with us down below. So we can be in the building until a little after 7:30. So let me introduce our panelists. I'm sure the four of them are probably well known to many of you, but I will introduce them nonetheless. So to my far left is Gerald Sumida, who is a partner at Carl Smith Ball and formerly served as the general counsel for the Asian Development Bank in Manila. But he joins us tonight to talk about his role in the 1970s as one of the chairs of the Commission on the Year 2000, a body tasked with exploring Hawaii's long-term policy challenges. Next, Tom Kaufman, an independent researcher, writer, and producer. In 1972, as many of you know, Tom wrote Catch a Wave, still, I think, the best book ever written about Hawaii politics that described the turmoil of that period. And since then, of course, he's written many other books about Hawaii history, including Nation Within and Inclusion, How Hawaii Protected Japanese Americans from Mass Internment, Transformed Itself, and Changed America. Then I'd like to welcome Barbara Maramoto, who was a delegate to the 1978 Constitutional Convention. She was then elected to represent the Kaimuki, Kahala, and Waialae area in the State House of Representatives, where she served from 1978 until 2012, making her one of the longest serving members of the state legislature. I think she is the second longest serving member, but we're not quite sure. And then, of course, Richard Barreca, to my left, is one of Hawaii's best-known journalists, covering the state's political landscape since the early 1970s. And as anyone who reads the Honolulu Star-Advertiser knows that he writes the On Politics column. So we'll get started, and we're going to go with the panelists in roughly chronological order, which means I'm going to ask Jerry to start us off with talking a little bit about the Commission on the Year 2000.
Thank you, Colin. Aloha, everybody. Pleased to have you here at this late hour in the afternoon, and myself delighted to be part of this very distinguished panel. Colin asked me to summarize a little bit this event called the Commission on the Year 2000 and the Governor's Conference on the Year 2000. And this is one of those events which made a big splash in Hawaii and then faded. But around the world, it made an even bigger splash with a lot of influence in many different countries and international and regional organizations. And I'll touch a little bit upon that. But if you can take yourself back literally or virtually to about 1965, 1969, 1970, 30 years hence was going to be the year 2000, the millennium. And many of us remember that with a certain degree of panic, because that was the Y2K problem, when the computers couldn't do the zero and the world was going to self-destruct or something. And of course, nothing happened. They fixed it. But at that time, it was looking toward that year. And there were a number of people in Hawaii, including Governor Burns, Lieutenant Governor Ariyoshi, George Chaplin, the head of the Advertiser, Bud Smizer of the Star Bulletin, our legislative leaders, and many people in the legislature, as Barbara well knows, experienced World War II. They were either in the service or living here, were affected by it. And for many of them, especially in the legislature, the question was, we know what we don't want. What is Hawaii's role in the Pacific? What can Hawaii contribute to peace, world peace, at least regional peace? And that was a lot of the motivation behind them. And Hawaii as a young state was beginning to mature. So what George found, he had an idea which came out of a publication of the National Academy of Sciences, which was looking toward the year 2000 and was taking basically an academic policy-oriented approach to it. And George thought much more broadly. He talked to Governor Burns, he talked to members in the legislature, and they basically centered on the idea that Hawaii should look to the future 30 years away and try to determine what Hawaii should be, what the people of Hawaii wanted to accomplish. In that course, they got a number of international advisors, very prominent futurists and others, and one of them was Yehezkel Jor from Israel, Hebrew University in Tel Aviv. And Jor said something interesting. He said, don't just think about the future, think about alternative futures. And if you think about alternative futures, you might be in a position to choose a preferred future that you can fashion. And he and all of the others said, make sure you make this a full participatory event and exercise, not just to a bunch of legislators or a bunch of academics or a bunch of think tank people, but do this with everybody in the society. And the net result was the decision to have a governor's conference on Hawaii on the year 2000. And to prepare for that, an advisory committee headed by George Chaplin, a new professor that came here, Glenn Page from Princeton, who was one of my professors there, and a new budding professor at the University of Hawaii named Jim Dater, who was really Hawaii's first pure futurist. They got together and they organized a whole series of programs on a statewide basis, and in effect set up 10 task forces to deal with the following subjects. And I'll just quickly read them. Hawaii's people and lifestyles, quality of personal life, the natural environment, housing and transportation, political decision-making and the law, the economy, science and technology, education, the arts, and Hawaii and the Pacific community. This was on a statewide basis, but each of the counties also decided they wanted in, and they took the very same set of topics and examined those topics from the standpoint of each of the counties. And again, the focus, which was accomplished sometimes more or less depending upon the subject, was what could be alternative futures and what future of those alternatives might be the preferred one. So that was the preparatory work. And a report was produced, and in fact, reports from each of the islands were also produced, and they became the working papers for the Governor's Conference on the year 2000, 4 days in August of 1969. There were, yes, major speakers that came in to address the group. The reports were presented and discussed in 13 working groups. various areas of consensus emerged, various areas of tension emerged. And one of the main sources of tension was a generational one, where a lot of the younger people wanted to move more quickly, more comprehensively, a heavy leaning toward environmental concerns, then in the process of being, of evolving and being defined. So ultimately, when the conference ended, it didn't quite succeed in defining alternative futures for each of these areas, or even for the state as a whole, nor did it have a preferred future. But it got a lot of people thinking, discussing, and the hope then was, how do we continue this? And the way it was continued, because there was a report from the commission, and because of George Chaplin and Bud Smizer, who headed up the two major papers here, a lot of very, very good and constructive publicity and editorial comments. But one concrete event that came out of it, again, the initiative of Governor Burns, was the formation of something called the Commission on the Year 2000 to continue the work of the Governor's Conference. Because think of all the conferences we've been at to discuss policy issues. Everybody gets very excited. They think about things that can be done and think about should be done. And then the conference ends and everybody goes home and they got to do the dishes and go to school and go to work, and somehow it all fades away. Well, the group did not want that to happen. So the commission was established as a state commission. George Chaplin was the first head, and a very distinguished group drawn statewide basis. And they tried to continue a lot of these programs over years, and it did continue in existence for about 10 years thereafter. And in the first few years had a lot of programs, mainly on Oahu, but also on the state basis, bringing a lot of key speakers here. So when you look back on it, besides the establishment of the commission, the other question is, well, what else really happened? A number of intangible things happened that had some really effective results. And one of them was a consciousness of, a greater awareness and consciousness of how should Hawaii diversify its economic future or its economy to prepare for the future, especially as the whole region was beginning to develop. How could Hawaii harness its indigenous renewable energy resources instead of relying only on importing fossil fuel? Because everybody knew that you're going to run out of prehistoric dinosaurs and forests at some point, and Hawaii was going to be in a very difficult situation if oil supplies were disrupted or stopped. How should land use planning be better done? So amendments to the state land use law, which was pretty historic in the United States, were made, and other initiatives like that, both policy initiatives that the executive branch of not just the state government, but also county governments took, as well as specific pieces of legislation. So that was a legacy. It prepared, I think, in a very general way, both sentimental as well as thought-wise, the groundwork for what ultimately became the Constitutional Convention, and then beyond that. So Tom, Colin, let me stop.
Thanks, Jay. I think we'll go next to Richard.
Oh, thank you very much. My preliminary remarks are going to be much shorter and not that thorough either. Because my opening question is, does anyone here remember Macaulay Chop Suey? All right. I'm trying to bring you into what you should be thinking about if you're remembering the Constitutional Convention from the years and years and years ago, because that's the era we're talking about. Or if you went to the Termite Palace on King Street to watch a ball game. That's what we're thinking about. So it was a long time ago, 1978's Constitutional Convention, 47 years ago. And one of the quotes I wrote down about remembering stuff that far back means that time is always the sandpaper that smooths all the rough edges so we can remember the bad as well as the good. So you have to be able to think about the whole thing, and maybe it takes 47 years to put it into perspective. Now, there are several major outputs of the Constitutional Convention. Um, it, I'm not going to go into any more than what Jerry said about why it happened, except that it was there and they had to do it, and people wanted to vote for it. And surprisingly, one of the things that just came out as not agreed upon, but luckily needed, was that incumbents in office should not run for the con-con. And that triggered, first of all, there was a little bit of a weeding of whether or not that's really going to happen. But I believe that only two office holders, members of the state legislature, actually served on the con-con. Everyone else was new. Now, as a news reporter, for me, I thought that was a vital thing, because if there's anything we don't really want to do is have to cover all the people who are already there. We've already heard the speeches. We want something new, and we want other people to be able to get in on the gang. It launched the political careers of the people who would then later on dominate completely Hawaii politics. And I'll mention some of the delegates then include Carol Fukunaga, Gerald Higino, Helene Hale, Tom Hamilton, who doesn't get enough praise for his work at the University of Hawaii, Jeremy Harris, the mayor, Clarice Hashimoto, who is going to go on to become a legislator, Charlene Ho, founder of the Hakipu'u Learning Center, Leslie Hara, another legislative leader, Barbara Maramoto, another legislative leader, Lehua Fernandez-Salling, legislator, Joe Suki, all's forgiven, Jim Shawn, and David Wahe. It's too bad that David couldn't make it tonight, because I remember at 47 years ago trying desperately to track down Wahe when CONCON was just forming, and he was bringing in his group of supporters, and among several other groups. And politics is having three people, because if you have one person, that's already agreed upon. If you have two people, you have a split. But you have three, you can go 2, 1, 1, 2, back and forth, and that's what makes politics. And so coalitions are what were important in forming the different groups within the 1974 CONCON. That's the 78 CONCON. That's the thing that is so important, are the coalitions that form. And I remember that one of the ones that was at the beginning not something that reporters talked about a lot was the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. It was a sleeper that turned out to be one of the major things that we would report on and would become an institution. Other things that at the beginning of CONCON were so important, but sort of, I think, correct me for all you in the audience if I'm wrong, but we started out CONCON by saying, oh my God, the right to privacy. What is that going to be? What is that going to be? And I know my editors asked me, said, you know, the right to privacy, what is that going to do to the newspapers? Is this good? Is this bad? What do we need? What are we going to do about this? How do we look at this? And I said, well, I don't know, but I'll sure have it on the paper. And it was big then, not now. Other things that then became big in a very small political way were at that time, George Ariyoshi was heading into his third term as governor, and the right to resign from office after 2 terms was one of the big things that was, at the time, it was like, you're going to kick the governor out because he's had so many terms. How can you do that? And that was the kind of a thing that was almost a personal insult to the governor at the time. But other things that I'm just going to touch on quickly. The Legislative Salary Commission. Before that, it was boys. The boys in the back room would decide who's going to see how much the senator and the president get. And that's the way it was done. So that commission was totally new. How long is the legislative session going to be? Bill deadlines, another issue. Splitting it up. Staggering the terms of office for members of the legislature. That was another thing that it was not at all in the rules of the game before the CONCON. I would think that perhaps one of the things that was, now it's accepted and it's the way everything is, but the Judicial Selection Commission was so important because before that, the judges were picked because they were either being rewarded or they were being pushed aside as legislators. And this was how you had a favorite legislator and you rewarded him with a judgeship, or you had someone who was just causing too much trouble in the legislature and you iced him out by putting him on the courts. So that was the difference with the Judicial Selection Commission. You really changed some of the basic politics. But I'm not going to keep on going on because Barbara wants to talk about the real politics of what was
I don't,
there.
not necessarily. It's been so long since CONCON, and I really had to rely on my memory, which is probably failing at this point. And I don't have any more papers left over. And I was wondering, well, what proposals did I introduce? I didn't have a list. Everything in my office went to archives when I retired 13 years ago. And I gave away my books, the Journal of the CONCON, and I guess I could have come downtown and asked somebody to help me research, but I was kind of lazy, so I didn't do that. But let me try and answer the question that Colin asked is, how did this CONCON come about? What was pushing it at that point? And if I could find the first page, I could start. Let's see. I'm disappointed that Governor Waihei's not here tonight because I was relying on him to talk about a lot of the facts and figures and proposals and whatever. And then I was just going to bounce off of him, but he's not here. So Richard, you'll have to you're doing pretty well in
I
that.
just, don't put me,
Besides,
that's a,
yeah,
that's a different level.
well, he was an insider, so he could tell you a lot more of, what the thinking was. I was very much an outsider, part of a group called the Independents, which was a small
Yes.
group, about 10, maybe 20. We're a minority
It was
anyway.
yes.
Yeah. And, but it was an interesting thing. I mean, it's like I was a staffer, so I was able to get some bills in right away. They call them proposals. And it was, some people had come straight off from a neighbor island. They didn't know the first thing about passing bills, and so they just started from ground zero. So we kind of had a really big head start. But I don't know exactly what the 1975 legislature was thinking, because they're the ones who would have had to appropriate the funds for the con and to put it on the ballot in 1976. What made them put it on the ballot? What was the debate at that time? I have no idea. I was working at the legislature, but I was in a legislative office, so I wasn't aware of that. But I was thinking back, I think statehood had a lot to do with the, making changes in the Constitution, because when you become a state, that was tabula rasa, a clean slate. There's no Constitution. You just start off with clean slate. And so I think you still have that feeling that we could introduce great legislation, the Land Use Act, the Land Reform Act, where you could buy the land under your house. You could have a statewide Board of Education. So some of that thinking might have still been around when it came to another constitutional convention. On the other hand, there's also a feeling that we need reform. And we had gone through Watergate, 1974. So people are very aware of corruption and the need for democracy. And there was a high three where legislators could get an appointment after they retired, and they could get their pension based on the higher salary. So that was a good deal if you could get it, because legislators in those early days were making $1,000 a month. In fact, jokingly, I tell some people, well, yeah, why did I run for Con? It was a raise for me. I was a researcher making $843 a month, and they were getting $1,000. But still, later, if they could get an appointment as a deputy director of health or a judge, they'd be making $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, and their pension would be based on that. So I think there was a desire for some sort of reform also. Democracy was very important. A big issue was initiative, referendum, and recall. And so we didn't have that on the state level, and many mainland states have them. So that was something that Common Cause was pushing. And Common Cause was doing really well on the mainland. They were really a big force. We had a very strong chapter here locally. There's a girl named Carol, somebody who was a very effective lobbyist and organizer for the group. So that was kind of like the issue that the independents gathered around. Also, there was a desire to fix the finances of the state, and some people felt like we were growing too fast and appropriating too much money and taxing too much. And I remember Ariyoshi, when he had just come in after Burns had passed away, had faced a deficit. And I think that really worried him. He cut a lot of funds that governors are able to do in Hawaii, kind of hurt the schools. And the economy was in a transition state. Agriculture was kind of phasing out. Pineapple was going south. Sugar used to be king, then they were going to other shores. Some plantations were closing on the Big Island and Hamakua, and on the Oahu plantation on the here. So sugar was no longer king. It was kind of interesting. HSPA used to be the key lobbyist.
Oh,
And when I got in, they were sort of looking for a subsidy to do research and trying to find a sweeter pineapple or marketing information. The old guard was passing too. Ariyoshi had come in. That means Burns was gone. A lot of his political cohorts were gone. The Big Five was fading out along with agriculture. And the ILW had been a big force politically with sugar, but now the public employees were starting up, HDEA and HSTA, and then tourism was also just starting up. But they had, the hotel employees were union members. And so they were a growing force, kind of edging out the ILW politically. It would take a while though. And the old legislators were going out. I remember the old guys like Tyra and Senator Tyra and that, but they'd go out for 2-hour lunches, you know, and I'm sure in those days it was like 2 martini lunches. But then there were some younger guys coming in, like Anson Chong, remember him? And let's see, John Leopold for the Republicans. And then there was a lot of women coming into the legislature. That was a real change. Patsy Mink, of course, was a big pioneer. Pat Psyche, Patsy Young was replaced her husband who passed away. So anyway, that's sort of my thoughts regarding what caused CONCON to happen and where it kind of had a little direction and a few goals.
Thanks, Barbara. Tom?
Yeah, I agree with everything, all the observations that have been made. I would add, like a sort of an umbrella generalization, that the turbulence and the idealism of the nationally the 1960s very much occurred in Hawaii in the 1960s, but continued way into the 1970s in the face of, you know, the era of Richard Nixon and so on. And I think it finally washed up on the shores of 1978. That's sort of metaphoric, but I think there's an inner validity to it. The thing that struck me as strange, just watching it from a distance, I was out of the press by that time. I had covered the 1968 Constitutional Convention, which was a real snoozer, you know, because the 1968 convention was based on the idea that the Convention of 1953, the Constitution of 1953, had been drafted as a model constitution to convince the United States Congress that Hawaii was ready for statehood. And so the 1968 Constitutional Convention basically just affirmed all of that, and then, but to that they added some very crucial little variable, which was the institution of public collective bargaining, which was brought about by pretty much by the Hawaii Federation of Teachers, which then kind of faded, but in the HGEA and the UPW I think was involved. But that was significant. But the in spite of many movements and sort of, you know, turbulence in ideas and things that Gerald talked about, all this complicated idea development and attempts at planning were going on. There was this view of very established people which I hesitate to say the establishment, but you know, basically the keepers of conventional wisdom, that nothing need happen at this convention, and sort of unstated was nothing really should happen. It's like this, meet and review and deal with some little things and go home. And what did happen was really, I think, monumental and far-reaching
Remarkable.
as a generalization. And the fact that there weren't legislators there, I agree with Richard's observation. Donald Ching, I think, was there.
When did that? He was.
And what?
And Bob Tyra.
And Bob Tyra. And they were sort of working on a rearguard thing of like keeping the lid on things and having, children, ushering the children along and so on. That didn't work. They lost control of the thing. And they lost control to several deeply held impulses and movements. And one of them, Gerald is a chapter and verse on, and that was something that was of tremendous, the commission was an aspect of something that was of tremendous importance at that time, which was a discussion of planning and ideation about the future. And it reflected, and I think we should focus, it reflected a deeply held sense that Hawaii was changing so rapidly through the intensity and pace of development and through various outside influences impinging. And it was a deeply held desire to somehow get a hold of things and get a better compass that would lead us into the future. And I think that was very fundamental. Of greatest, and there was also, and Barbara, I agree with Barbara completely, there was this reaction to the corruption of the Nixon era, and that led to, and I think there was a kind of local versus Malahini schism. Malahini's solution to corruption was initiative referendum recall, right? Oh, and the local view that was quite clearly articulated by David Higino in his Palaka Power tract.
That's what I was just going to bring up. That.
Okay, was we have very successfully controlled our political system through voting and the voter base, and the voter base is majority people rooted in Hawaii, local people, etc. And we're not going to change that. And that became a very pointed conflict, I believe. And it was finally voted down, but sort of quite narrowly. All the while, the most interesting person there was Jean David Waihe III. And he was the majority leader, right? His title was majority leader. That there was no office that was called majority leader. That was a fabrication. That was a projection of his vivid imagination and other people's vivid imagination about him, and his skill in shuffling all these different disparate combinations of people into a sort of a vote and a working majority, and lining up all these other complicated things to gain agreement on what should pass. And lo and behold, like, it began with a preamble, which says, the preamble is quite interesting if you go back and read it. The preamble says, we, the people of Hawaii, declare our right to determine our own future. And it's an extraordinary statement. And I think it genuinely set a tone for an umbrella of all those remarkable things. In terms of like long-term huge things, the clarification that water is a public trust, that subsurface resources are a public trust. They are not to be owned by private entities. They are yours and mine. They belong to all of us. And it was an extension of Chief Justice Richardson's, McBride case is such a famous, complicated water law tone, but it was a resurrection of Native Hawaiian practice and concept, which is in the American system of commodifying everything, revolutionary. The fire was Kaho'olawe, which we haven't talked about. Frenchie DeSoto was a janitor. She was the chief janitor, but she was the janitor at the Capitol, who found it in herself to become a great leader. And she did it, I think, significantly. Somebody should write her biography, but it was inspired by, I think maybe Kavika can talk about this later. Yeah. But he should be up here. Inspired by the occupation by 9 young men of the island of Kaho'olawe as it was being bombed as a target and decimated and destroyed as a living entity by the United States Navy. And it was the rawest expression of resistance and the most transformative expression of resistance, leading us. There's a direct line from Kaho'olawe to the very heart of the Constitutional Convention and to Frenchie's formation of the Hawaiian Affairs Committee. When she said she wanted to have such a committee, they said, well, why would you want to do that? And she assembled the people, she sent out a call, a kahea, for people who had been at Kaho'olawe and said, boy, you come and you stay here and you work. Walter Riddick came in a pair of blue jeans thinking he was going to stay a day or two, and he stayed for weeks. And he talked to everybody about native gathering rights, because that was what he was preoccupied with. Other people talked about other people talked about the preservation of the Hawaiian language, and the Hawaiian language becoming a co-equal official language with English, etc. And in the squeaker of John Waihe's majority, management of the majority, the Malihini votes program got voted down. The Hawaiian package was passed. And somehow there were people who, those votes overlapped. Because you could, that is of far-reaching importance to this day, I believe. I think we know that. The water law thing is of far-reaching importance to this day. The whole doctrine of public trust is slowly, Gerald knows all about this and I don't, because he's a distinguished attorney. Doctrines of water law and public trust are being advanced through litigation slowly, but they are being advanced. This thing still has a life in it these 47 years later. And the life is I was on an interesting panel with John Waihe and with Carol. And what they both said was, we passed this 1978 convention, and ever since then, we've been fighting over it. And I think that that's true. I think there was this great movement of change, and it is still yet to be digested. And I think it's part of why we haven't had another convention. There's all sorts of complicated stuff, but that's part of it. But we're still working on that. Water law being a kind of a good complicated example. The status of OHA, status of funding of OHA even, still being an example of that.
That was one of the big things that came from, sui generis, it just came from CONCON because of CONCON. It was not because of beforehand
That's right.
people were going to set this up. That was not a thing. But it turned out to be one of the major founding parts of CONCON, and what was going to happen was Office of Hawaiian Affairs.
So I think that we are, in a way, still working on it. But I think we need to work harder on it. I think we need to reawaken the subject. I really welcome and appreciate this. 10 years ago, I was part of the panel in which I argued against having another convention in that cycle. And I was part of this, we liberals wanted to make sure that the conservatives didn't get in and shut down things like public trust, for example. And so that was the argument. And the law school had forums, and it was a very considered conversation. And there was a quiet decision made repeatedly not to have it. I recently gave a talk in which I said, I think there's so much unrest now going on. There's so much sense of underground turbulence. Let's just own up to it and have a constitutional convention. And I didn't get much response, except from John Waihe, and he came up to me and he says, "Well, you got to give me a call." So I leave it at that.
Well, I talked to him about a week ago. I just chatted with him, and he said that he feels people have been talking about the need for another con-con. And I said, well, on why? You know, on what subject? And he says he doesn't know the agenda, but he's heard the feeling that
Yeah.
this should happen.
Richard?
I think that's a very important, but doesn't look in the future at all. But that's because too many people are afraid of the future. But another constitutional convention would be a strong and good thing. I think if you trust in people, and you have to if you're going to be in a democracy. And I think that I trust enough voters, people, that at the end of the day, they're going to do the right thing. They're always going to surprise you. And another constitutional convention would come up. I mean, there's this whole internet thing buzzing around there that really should be addressed in a constitution. Anyway.
What do you think, Joe? Would you, about the possibility of another convention?
For me,
Yeah.
I'm not sure, because you can have conventions, and if the times and the people and the attitudes aren't right, you could have on the one side total chaos, and on the other side, a knight on a white horse. We had that experience recently, a couple of years ago, and you can't tell. And things are different these days because of social media, and we do not have trusted sources of news, and not just trusted sources of news, but sources that a very significant portion of the public, if not the majority, give credence to. And we know all the stories about how information and malinformation and misinformation and non-information is disseminated, and that the major sources of news in the olden days, ABC, CBS, CNN, so forth and so on, oftentimes don't really give us what they used to give us. And in any event, most people don't get their news from them. And so when you put all of that together, and you know, a lot of analysis by a lot of scholars like Tim Snyder and others about what you need for a real democratic society and how it can operate, and what happens when you undermine it in various ways, that raises some real questions about what you could do. You could also take an example of various elections held in other countries, Eastern Europe, South America, Africa even, where media manipulation can help fashion a result. And the old discussion, you know, John Stuart Mill's idea about the free, or the marketplace of free ideas, where you discuss it, debate it, you're willing to be convinced, you try to persuade the other person, but you have an open mind, has been replaced in many respects that if you bear a certain label, you are inherently wrong and possibly worse. And that obviously doesn't foster dialogue, especially since with all of the stuff that's been going on that we've been reading about on gerrymandering, you're deliberately setting up pockets of voter and other public response that will skew a democratic result. So I think it would be very, very difficult to have a really good and effective constitutional convention at this point, and certainly without a lot of pre-preparation. And that's not a small group of people figuring out what to happen. That's a society trying to get his act together. Not that they all agree on the same thing, but trying to get his act together on the procedures taken, the degree of mutual respect that's going to be accorded each to the other, and the desire to come out with something that is for the total common good. You know,
Look
and
at the enormous amount of pre-con work that was done back then. It's that, Tom and I were both writing about it back then and it was a thing, but it was forgotten. But now if you ever were going to do another constitutional convention, you would have to be able to send out enough signals in advance through legislation, through laws that had been written that we're fixing to have a con, so y'all are going to be the people who are going to be the delegates to select the delegates or something like that, but a large preparation for another constitution would be much needed. And
well, you know,
none of that is anywhere close to being done right now.
yeah, in my feeling, the process is important, but it's necessary but not sufficient. Now, one of the things, and this is not unique, but one of the things that the Governor's Conference in the year 2000 did, I mentioned that they had a bunch of task forces on a statewide basis. Okay, the task forces had all kinds of people, but as a number of the international observers said, this was an experiment in anticipatory democracy where very ordinary folks got involved. Yes, you had the politicians and the academicians and the this, that, and the other thing, but really ordinary folks got involved. And some of those ordinary folks went into the Constitutional Convention, and later that went into seek positions of governance in the legislature and whatever. But you had very ordinary people. And there's nothing wrong with very ordinary people because they're always held up to be, you know, that's what the society is and that's the kind of people we should have in places of discussion and even power. But we also know what happens politically. Well, my feeling, if you're going to do the preparation, then the process has to be such and the encouragement and the lobbying, if you will, on a popular basis have to be such. So very ordinary people who end up to be very wise and very talented and very passionate and very dedicated and very volunteers participate.
Well, with that, I think we will turn to your questions. We have a little less than 30 minutes, and I want to thank you all for coming and give you enough time to ask these distinguished panelists what you're thinking. So we'll take questions from folks who are here, and then we can take some questions from Zoom as well. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand. Yes, sir.
I think one of the things that I kind of didn't hear, but I was around in those days, and controlling growth. That was one of the major issues of the day. Hawaii was coming out of sugar and pineapple, and land was suddenly available. And the idea was, well, are we just going to be overwhelmed with all this growth that's going to take place? So how do we control growth? We're part of the United States. We can't tell people they can't come. So how do we ensure that the Hawaii that comes out of that growth, that change, out of the agrarian base that we had, how do we make sure that that doesn't destroy Hawaii? I think that was one of the major concerns at the time. So any thoughts about that? I didn't hear anybody mention that. So
So sort of how did questions about controlling growth affect what happened at CONCON?
Well, there used to be a time when going over Red Hill was a big trip, and now it's just there, or just a couple of blocks away, and so I think that controlled growth done happen. uh, and we haven't done it. We've talked about controlled growth, but I don't think it's not something that we have set up to actually do. I think it's going to be uncontrolled growth. And it'd be nice to, but.
I think it's, the government could impede growth because, like in your field, you have zoning and certain areas where you can have certain type of tourism and so, but it's hard. I think most of the energy for growth does come from the private sector. I remember Ryoshi in the '78 election, he was running on planning and state planning. And so he had state plans for water and agriculture and tourism and every different field. And then when we got into the legislature, we had to deal with this all the time. Everything had to fit into the state plan. But, you know, you could do certain governmental functions according to the state plan, but he wanted 7,000 hotel rooms a year. And you know you can't, government can't control that. It's all impetus from, you know, big companies on the mainland or some hotel owner here, but so growth to me is like, it's mostly the energy from the private sector. And government, to me, sometimes retards it. And I don't think I'm answering your question right, but ask it again in a different way.
I agree that that certainly was one of the big impulses that were going into the convention and throughout that whole period, yeah. And I think it relates to what Gerald talked about, what Ariyoshi ran on. And it led to, I think it created an environment at the convention for a strong assertion of government,
Yes,
a strong hand by government.
yes.
And so, you know, in that sense, I think that it landed.
Yes, I think that Hawaii always accepted government. There was never a revolution against government. Government was, from the monarchy, was something that, yeah, and that's why initiative and referendum and recall just drove people nuts in Hawaii because that was no government. It was all things that because
Yeah,
it
it
would
was literally
replace government, yeah.
legislation by public relations campaign.
Other questions?
I guess I was wondering if you could possibly elaborate more on the roles of like social movements and organized like society, civil society during that time, because I think like during that time, like leading up to the 78 ConCon, there was like a lot of organized social movements, like an organized civil society that was like active, engaged, organized, you know, like out there that I guess if there was another ConCon, it doesn't seem like I guess that necessarily might not exist or is a lot different than it might have been leading up to the 78 ConCon. And so I kind of I guess was wondering if you could touch a little bit more on the social movements and civil society aspect of what was going on during that time leading up to the 78 ConCon and how that influences the ConCon itself.
Social movement.
The Hawaiian protest,
Well, here,
the environmental movement,
this,
the government reform movements.
I've got my original copy of David Higino's Palaka Powers that I brought along, which was the fuel for part of the social movements that were so important in the Constitutional Convention and would be important in anything like that. And what was important was that the news media couldn't figure out how the hell are we going to describe the different groups in the Constitutional Convention? Because they're not Republicans, they're not Democrats, so we can't use those thumbnails. We need something else. So we became the Waihe group, but pretty soon you couldn't say this is the Waihe group. So it became the majority group, and the other group became the independent group. And so it was the majority against the independents, just because you needed two to tango on that. But I mean, those were the different sides of that. Joanne Yukimura was an independent leader.
Membership in those groups would change.
Yes, sure. And they're probably changing retelling.
Probably.
I can't imagine it. I'm trying to think of some social organizations at the time, and I really don't know. I mean, it was that post-Vietnam, and I guess people were very happy that the war was over. And these days, I'm afraid of certain social issues being taken away, certain social freedoms, and sometimes I'm afraid of a CONCON would be one based on getting rid of same-sex marriage or abortion or other social issues. So I'm a little ambivalent about CONCON, you know. In the early days when I was there, of course, you know, let the people decide. They know what's best. It's a democracy after all, majority rules. But in the past year or so, I've become very fearful of the majority sometimes.
And the other part about that was the power, some of the power groups, whether or not they want, for instance, do the unions want a CONCON? Right now, it's no. They do not want, because the only thing they can see is that the rights that are existing now are going to be somehow changed by a constitutional convention. The big thing is, how do we raise money, and what do we raise money for in Hawaii? And obviously the unions are players in that. They want the money for their workers, and so they don't really want changes in the way it's done. But is that the best way to do it? Could we do a better job at it? It would be up to the people who run for if there were another constitutional convention.
Next question.
Hi. Since there were conversations of statehood and conflicting standpoints at the time, I was wondering what specific conversations led the Constitutional Convention, and how does this impact contemporary conceptions of the Constitutional Convention that we're still processing?
Could you say that again? So is your question about whether the issue of statehood came up?
Definitely. I believe I wrote down that Mr. Kaufman has mentioned that the conversations of statehood had occurred during the time, and I was wondering just the different standpoints and how these standpoints are affecting our conversations that we're having of this Constitutional Convention today.
My point was simply that the Constitution that we have today evolved from a kind of model constitution that was adopted in 1953, actually, that was designed to impress on the national government that Hawaii should be a state. And I think that if you look at the 1978 amendments, it was by whatever this uneven process, but if you weigh the whole thing, it was an attempt to more forcefully address Hawaii as a unique society. And I think that was expressed partly through the Hawaiian Amendment, partly through the public trust, natural resources, right of people to right of the individual to have standing in court on environmental issues, and so on and so on. These were all things that were more unique to what makes Hawaii unique. And I think that's an important focus. Okay, so I appreciate your question.
Actually, there's another way to look at this, which really underscores what Tom says. And I'm going to state the obvious to all of us. Before Captain Cook and company came, Hawaii had its own society, or actually societies, because each of the islands were different, and even regions of each of the islands were different. Go back through ancient Hawaiian history. And then from that time on to the current time, when you go to post-war period and then up into the 70s, you really had two things that existed in Hawaii, from a political to a certain extent, economic to a great extent, sociological and psychological standpoint. On the one hand, you had a culture that, and by the way, in this respect, Hawaii is not unique. And without necessarily getting to the ins and outs of the colonial movement on a global scale, this has been repeated many, many times. You had an indigenous society that had a whole set of laws and cultures and norms and attitudes that were really group-centered, not individual-centered, to the extent of the individual is prime over the group. And we know that. And so-called Western society, including the United States variant that ultimately came and prevailed in Hawaii, has a slightly different cultural, economic, sociological aspect to it, where the individual is primary and the greater society is, to a certain degree, small degree, secondary. You know, if you want to, you can go back to Star Trek, Spock's thing, the interests of the many over the one. And you don't want to, I don't want to oversimplify that, but you have had this overlay. So you go back to, for example, the Great Mahele. You took a traditional landholding system and put aside all the historical mythology that accompanies a lot of these discussions and get down to the very basics. But you took a traditional landholding, land using, land living structure, and you changed it by introducing individual ownership. So you could take a piece of property, whatever it was beforehand and whatever role it fitted in with all of the other surrounding pieces of property, and sell it to whomever you want to. And that person, by and large, could do anything with that property, even though it was seemingly totally inconsistent with what went there beforehand. Okay, see, that was in many, many different respects a conflict, two cultures overlaying with points of friction here and there, that from time to time, as we know, before Hawaii became a state, even under the monarchy, but especially after that, and especially when immigration came to work the plantations and so forth, we had very, very nasty incidents. And most of us come across our knowledge of that by accident because we don't have courses in our schools that talk about the history of the labor movement, the Filipino worker massacre on Kauai, et cetera, and all kinds of other stories. And we're not saying this to be good, bad, or indifferent, it's just a historical fact. And that's not going to be changed. But it shows points of friction when you have a traditional culture that is overlain. And then on top of that, again, especially after the post-war period and accelerating through all of this, and I'm obviously people like Tom and Rich should know much more about this stuff than I do, so I'm impinging a little bit upon their historical turf. But when you get to this period, and then even beyond to today, all kinds of other changes, and not just changes, but transformation in the society takes place. You have new generations that come up, they got new interests, new aspirations, you got things happening out external to Hawaii, and not just from the mainland, but also in the whole Asia-Pacific region. So economies change, sugar goes out because we weren't good enough in the sense of meeting competition and we're protected by tariffs, and so forth and so on. And newcomers come, all of this stuff, and gets mixed up. And the one thing that keeps us together is the overlay of the mixed and blended Hawaiian culture. And that value system that we all know, ohana and so forth and so on, everybody adopts that. And basically that's the glue that holds this place in many, many different respects together. But you still have that tension of the individual being prime on the one side and the individual not necessarily being prime on the other side. So when the 1978 convention comes along, the whole Hawaiian rights situation becomes crystallized in what ultimately became OHA. Was that in isolation? No, and we know that, because the Hawaiian Renaissance, the cultural Renaissance, started in the early 70s. And that transformed everything, not only in Hawaii, but outside of Hawaii. And people really adopted that, respected that, wanted that. And one of the reasons why Hawaii became such an attractive tourist center was really cultural tourism that people wanted, even though they didn't quite articulate it that way. So we have all of these changes taking place, many of them beyond our control, some of them partly within our control, many of them, much of them totally bewildering, like what we're going through right now with all of the stuff coming in from Washington, you know, with the tariffs and everything else. And that's just the economic and the political part. How about the sociological and the psychological part? You know, we talked about civil society before the Constitutional Convention. My guess it was a little bit different. There was a lot more organization. There was a lot more volunteerism. There was a lot more community stuff that people did. And today, the most immediate contrast we had, and we all know it, pre-COVID and post-COVID. A lot of things that existed, not institutionally, but within the society, getting together, going to restaurants, community organizations, doing stuff, et cetera, pre-COVID, people got used to not doing it when you couldn't do it. So one of the questions is the glue getting softer or disappearing? And are we becoming a society of atomistic individuals? Or is there, which is what was one of the, I think, strong forces that emerged from the Constitutional Convention, time, not the convention itself, but the time, can that glue be recreated? And can that same sense of very, very passionate, creative desire to continue the work of the Governor's Conference on all islands, which is summarized in this book by George Chaplin and Glenn Page, can that be continued? Which is why the governor and the legislature did the commission on the year 2000. Was that going to be a be-all, end-all? No, of course not. Individuals, institutions, they change, priorities change, et cetera, et cetera. But that was the effort. And if you talk about all of that and the relevance to today, the question is, I think, not so much should we have another constitutional convention, but what was it that led to the convention? What was it that came out of the convention? And how do we further that? Because the two cultural overlays, you know, I'll give you one example. We have access, because of the Supreme Court decision, we have access to beaches. Yes, it's a real pain in the rear end if you live in certain areas and you gotta get a pathway, et cetera, and all these strangers come and they park their cars like in Lanakai and so forth. But putting that aside, you have access to beaches. In Puerto Rico, you have a hotel on the shoreline, you own the beach. Puerto Rican citizens do not have access to the beach, the same way here, okay? That's how, not necessarily a choice of that society, but that's how those two cultural overlays in that point, that's the friction that ended up that way. In Hawaii, the friction ended up a different way. Pathways, all oceans up to the watermark is public. And you have other aspects of that. Use of water rights, not just to grow taro in the olden ways, but how about the role of water in the protection of the entire environment for agriculture, for taro, for shrimp farming, for keeping the valleys green, keeping the pollution out, et cetera, et cetera. So it is more focused for us because we're a small place. And you know as well as I do, you know, you do something in one place, it's going to impact a whole lot of other places. And once you lose it, then you'll never get it back. And of course, in the olden days, quite frankly, a lot of water resources were handled relatively well by the plantations. Yes, they took a lot of water, but the irrigation dishes were there, they were maintained, the streams were kept clean. You could have taro farms and other kinds of water-based agriculture all around, etc. When the plantations left, what happened? The irrigation dishes fell into disuse. A lot of things simply were no longer possible, etc., etc. And mahi comes in, mahi pono comes in, and they try to redo an agricultural situation. But now they run into issues of water usage. And I'm not saying way is better or one way is not, but the issue is still there. And again, it's points of the friction between the two cultures. And, you know, you can decide for yourself whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. To me, the starting point is that's where we are. Then the next question is, what are we going to do about it? And the 1978 Constitutional Convention, without necessarily knowing what they were doing in this respect, tried to do something about it. The environment is really important, so there's now a constitutional right to a clean environment, and most other states don't have that. So when you read about all the environmental legislation, you know, why is Hawaii's complaint still there? Why is Montana still there, et cetera? Because those other constitutions have the same right to a clean environment. And that was a compromise to try to preserve what we have here as opposed to let it run out. So keep in mind, which to me has been kind of an interesting way to approach it, the two cultural overlays. It's just a fact of life. None of us can do anything about it because it started way back when. But presumably we could think about it today and maybe do something about it, how it works out tomorrow. So
Well, it's just about 7 o'clock, so we'll end in a minute, but I just want to give the panelists an opportunity to say one final word if the spirit moves them.
You know, I wanted to point out that there were some good things that did pass in 78 Concon. The right to privacy, the Water Commission, the property tax, the functions for determining it and collecting it were all given to the counties before the state did the assessments, and then the counties set the rate, so it was crazy. And besides OHA, Hawaiian became an official language. There was a balanced budget amendment and an expenditure ceiling, which happened, and that was my proposal. Also, elections for the Board of Education became nonpartisan. They used to run by party, and I was involved in that. There was a reapportionment commission to set the lines for the different districts, and I put that proposal in. Not so sure the commission is kind of operates the same way, but sort of underground. It's better to get a elected official, do it and be responsible for it. And UH, we gave UH autonomy, except over their financial matters. You could argue that with a few senators these days. Yeah. And the Judicial Selection Commission, which you mentioned, before the governor could appoint everyone, and now the Selection Commission does a good job of finding qualified candidates. The CJ still can't appoint all the district court judges, however, so that gives them a great deal of power. So it was, I think, as a whole, the 78 Concon was a success.
I would say, to add to that, if the proposal comes up again for a constitutional convention, no scam. Don't be afraid of it. It's vote yes for another Concon, just so that you can get another whack at all those different ideas that are now festering, that have not been addressed in past legislatures or Concons. And the other reason is to get a cast of characters, new people who have a power to do something, not just in the legislature, but actually to change Hawaii, which another constitutional convention would do. Anyway, that's it. Don't be afraid of another Concon.
Tom? You have the last word?
I'm gonna jump the bounds of this and say, everybody who thinks we should have another Concon in the next several years, raise their hand. And how many think it's a bad idea? And how many don't have an opinion? Okay. When Gerald was giving his talk about reasons for not having it, you might have seen me going from like this to like this. I could feel the forces that he was referring to, and it's like, yeah, he's right, but I'm right. And I think, I don't know if I'm right or not. I don't know if this is really what we need. I know that we need to really keep this discussion of constitutional government on the very front of our minds, and an exploration of what we now have in the Constitution is at least a partial way to do it. It pushes several steps forward to have another convention. If we had another convention, we would be throwing a lot of really crucial issues into the whirlwind. But within that is potentially Hawaii revitalizing a sense of purpose, a sense of clarity, and a greater agreement about who we are and where we might be going from here.
All right. Thank you all so much for sharing. And anyone who would like to stay, we have some refreshments on the first floor, so just head on down and we can hang out in the court until about 7:30.